until we get to the Q&A, when obviously we'll go back to and fro. I'm going to minimize my Zoom screen and hope that doesn't cut me off, because I'm not very good on these things. There we go. Yeah, that's gone to the corner. So let's begin with a moment of stillness. Let's reflect on what peace is and what peace is not, and where we are this evening, personally and nationally and internationally, with regard to peace. We ask the Lord to bless us this evening with peace, inner peace, peace in friendship, and peace with those far away. We hear the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. We pray for ears and hearts which listen, and that we will listen to each other humbly and gently. There may even be some words of wisdom in what I have to say. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. So I was kind of surprised to get the invitation, and in my wiser moments I'd probably have said thanks, but I'm not your man. But it happened to coincide with the Pope's statement about the courage of the white flag. That was bugging me, and I wanted to kind of chew that over. So writing this seemed a good way of engaging with an agenda of my own and to learn from that. And I hope it's not significant that I started writing it on April Fool's Day. You can tell me afterwards. Anyway, it probably heard at the time, and beginning of March, I think it came out. It was actually in February. The Pope's remark about the courage of the white flag made a big splash in the media, was often inaccurately reported, of course. And my own response was actually emotionally charged. Like many commentators, especially those sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause, part of me felt that he was kind of letting the side down. Talk of a white flag was worse than inappropriate, undermining a necessary Western unity. Others would have put it more strongly as a stab in the back, or just dismissed it as a sign of senescence or general out-of-touchness of the pontiff, as some people want to do and would like to believe. Unsurprisingly, many Ukrainians were furious. Zelensky pointedly contrasted the action of military chaplains in Ukraine who support us with prayer, with their discussion, and with deeds. This is indeed what a church of the people is, contrasting this with actions of those 2,500 kilometers away somewhere, offering virtual mediation between someone who wants to live and someone who wants to destroy you. The Ukrainian foreign minister predictably wrapped himself in the Ukrainian flag of yellow and blue. The flag by which we live, die and prevail. We shall never raise any other flags. And urged the Vatican to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, alluding to Pius XII's silence in the face of the Holocaust. And the mood of national defiance was even repeated by the head of the country's Catholic Church. Ukraine is wounded, but not conquered. Ukraine is exhausted, but it stands and will stand. And believe me, no one has any idea of surrendering. And that negative response was echoed around the Western world, if not elsewhere. It's not the time to talk about surrender by the Ukrainians, thundered Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. How about, for balance, encouraging Putin to have the courage to withdraw his army from Ukraine, suggested the Polish foreign minister. One must not capitulate in the face of evil. One must fight it and defeat it so that the evil raises the white flag and capitulates, added the Latvian president. I was surprised I shared some of that initial reaction, since I would not in any way describe myself as a follower of party lines, ecclesiastical or otherwise, and I deplore both war-making and preparations for war. We rarely, if ever, appreciate the depth to which shared social narratives, especially those learnt in infancy, can trammel our responses to new situations. I'm a child of the 1960s. I was socialized into the Cold War, not least by Airfix kits and Action Man, toys which gave an acceptance of killing without any understanding of what it might mean. We were also caught up in bloc thinking and bloc politics, better dead than red, as one UK foreign minister put it. Before the fall of the Berlin Wall, we all knew who the enemy were, the Russians, with leaders and led Politburo members and proletariat all undifferentiated in our minds. And of course, that assumption of Soviet threat was not inappropriate, given that Britain, the unsinkable aircraft carrier, as it was once called, was slated for oblivion in the event of the Cold War going hot. Moreover, my own family knew refugees from both Poland and Hungary who had been robbed of their homelands by Soviet tanks. All of that shared memory kicked in when I read the first account of the Pope's words. After 1989, we chose to forget the degree of enmity that the Iron Curtain had betokened, without seeing any need to resolve the hostility. Schadenfreude over the collapse of communism, combined with a dangerous belief in the end of history in Francis Fukuyama's sense, the final economic, political, and moral victory of capitalism. And a humiliated Russia was the fertile soil from which Putin sprang, much as the troubles of the Weimar Republic provided the breeding ground for Nazism. While I felt in that first moment of reaction that Pope Francis had let the side down, the assumption that a non-European pope, or any pope for that matter, should be on our side is an interesting one. After all, the cardinals went to the end of the earth, not Poland, for this one. Yet it's scarcely surprising that the human tendency to wrap God in our own flag should also wish to wrap the servant of God in the same colours. On the other hand, I had a hunch that the Pope was onto something very important. And the image that immediately came to mind was the story of the emperor who had no clothes. Only a little boy in the crowd could see that the king had been taken for a ride by the maker of the magnificent and non-existent robes, which he simultaneously was and wasn't wearing, because all the courtiers were so invested in keeping the monarch happy that they couldn't even see, never mind admit, the truth. Perhaps it takes the Pope near the end of his days, in that second naivete, which is not naive at all, but a purification of the human spirit, to name what is going on and what must be done. And I want to face the possibility that both horns of the dilemma, fight and sue for peace, might contain some element of truth. Indeed, what I want to explore is the possibility that the Catholic Christian calling might be to mediate between those two competing perceptions, the need not to back down or let down, and the need to stop now before it's too late. In the hope that we might achieve more light than heat, I'd first like to return to the interview in which Pope Francis made his controversial remarks, translating for you the relevant passages, not in order to undertake any special pleading on his behalf. The Vatican's own swift response indicated a recognition that even if he didn't misspeak, the phrase white flag was almost bound to provoke misunderstandings. Firstly, the interview with the journalist Lorenzo Bucella was for an episode of a Swiss TV program titled Cliché, without any sense of irony. This episode being dedicated to the colour white, the colour of good, of light, but on which errors and dirt become most visible. So that's the premise. And the questioning was as clunky as the concept. And it was off the back of the Pope's comments about the Israel-Gaza conflict, in which he underlined that when we look to history, to the wars we've lived through, they all finish with an accord. But the journalist asked the following. In Ukraine, some ask for the courage of surrender, of the white flag, but others say that would legitimize the stronger. What do you think? The Pope answered as follows. Well, that's one interpretation, but I believe that it is the one who sees the situation, thinks of the people, and has the courage to raise the white flag and negotiate who is the stronger party. And today one can negotiate with the help of international powers. There are some. This word negotiate is a courageous word. When you see that you are defeated, that things aren't working, have the courage to negotiate. You may be ashamed, but if you continue regardless, how many more dead will there be? And things will finish even worse. Negotiate in time. Look for some country which can act as a mediator. Today, for example, with the war in Ukraine, there are many who wish to act as mediators. Turkey, for example. Don't be ashamed to negotiate before things get worse. Having stated in a further answer that he too is available, and speaking now of the situation in Gaza, he takes up the interviewer's reference to the white of courage, il bianco di coraggio. Okay, the white of courage. but sometimes the anger which gives you courage isn't white. So that's what Pope Francis actually said. Now, what to make of it? Winston Churchill may not have actually said jaw, jaw, not war, war. That was uttered, it seems, by Harold Macmillan in 1958, but he did meet Stalin at Yalta. Perhaps more pertinently, Jesus asks his hearers, what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for peace, asks for terms of peace. The only possible objections to negotiation are either pride and a desire to punish or destroy the enemy in the belief that one's own forces are capable of achieving total victory, or because of a belief that the enemy cannot be trusted and would simply use any pause in fighting to regroup. And Putin is certainly a bad actor and an untrustworthy despot, cold, cynical, a poker player who uses his fellow citizens' lives as gambling chips, and perhaps a man now quite isolated from reality, perhaps even a little paranoid, sitting at the far end of his long table. So it's easy to understand the concern of the Czech theologian Thomas Halleck, who certainly deserves to be taken seriously, having lived through the Soviet occupation of his country and been ordained secretly as a Catholic priest in East Germany, of all places. What is happening in Ukraine is reminiscent of Adolf Hitler's strategy, of which the nations in this part of the world have experience. First, occupy the territories with linguistic minorities, and if the democratic world remains silent and succumbs to the illusion that agreements and compromises can be made with dictators, the expansion will continue. If the West were to betray Ukraine and give in to Moscow's demands, as it did in the case of Czechoslovakia on the threshold of the Second World War, it would not save the peace, but would encourage dictators and aggressors, not only in the Kremlin, but throughout the world. Rather than compromise, in Halleck's view, we should knock the murder weapon out of his hand. Easier said than done, however, given the worsening military situation in Ukraine as this summer progresses. Few are talking anymore about Ukraine expelling Russia from the Donbass or retaking Crimea. More are talking of postponing their need to enter into peace talks. Ukraine simply cannot sustain a level of losses in materiel, infrastructure, or soldiers which it is suffering. The number of Ukrainians living in the parts of the country controlled by Kiev has reportedly halved to 20 million, and Ukraine's population has an unusually small portion of men and women aged 15 to 30. A Ukrainian priest recently told me that 41,000 people left the country in 1 week in April 2024. A major Russian military breakthrough this summer is not impossible, even with a renewed flow of weapons from our side. As well as looking at the situation on the ground, and I acknowledge my assessment is merely that of an interested reader, not a military expert, we have to look to the changing geopolitical map of the world before we decide how best to act. The long drawn-out drama of the voting through of the latest US military aid package, held up for months in the Senate by right-wingers in order to seek party political advantage ahead of November's elections, demonstrates the jeopardy which not only Ukraine but the whole world faces in the event of the re-election of Donald Trump. An America First policy will leave not just Ukraine but the whole of NATO ill-equipped to resist any moves by Putin, other than by going nuclear. Moreover, the willingness of Trump and others to throw everything up in the air would seem to put in jeopardy the whole rules-based order that was established in the wake of World War II, together with the international entities, the UN, the International Criminal Court, and the rest, that were meant to provide a bulwark against adventuristic land grabs. Already, the apparent emergence of a new Russo-Sino-Indian bloc, each of these nations currently under the leadership of chauvinistic nationalist leaders, means that Western sanctions won't have the bite they might once have done. As we survey the geopolitical changes already underway, it's certainly worth asking whether there might not be some wisdom in the courage of the white flag, negotiating before the situation gets worse and the rug is pulled from under diplomatic channels. But then again, maybe Trump won't be elected. Maybe other things will change. Ethical calculations depend also on political expectations. Before we undertake a properly Christian reflection on how to respond to the Russian invasion, let's attend to the particular theatre of war that is Ukraine, because our social ethics have to be contextual and consequential, as well as principled and rationally founded. When we do attend to the history and geography of the conflict, we begin to see the complexity of the situation. Ukraine literally means borderland or on the edge. Unfortunately, that means it's where you have to invade if you want to go anywhere else, a bit like Belgium in Western Europe. It also means that your identity and legitimacy is likely to be called into question. You're a marginal territory. You're not here, you're not there, you're not that important, even with its enormous significance in world grain production and sunflower production. Think of the patronizing epithet for the country popular before the Bolshevik Revolution, Little Russia. More fundamentally, there's the question of the founding myth of the nation, both nations. Who are the rightful heirs of the Rus and of the Christianization of that realm under Prince Volodymyr in AD 988? The Duchy of Muscovy, the Ruski, or the Kievan Rushini, Ruthenians, as they were later known? We don't need to chronicle the various competing regimes which have attacked or held parts of Ukraine down the years: Mongol, Lithuanian, Polish, Russian, Ottoman, German, Austro-Hungarian, simply to note that this is a land of multiple competing and irreconcilable narratives. Perhaps the most worrying of those narratives right now is Ruski Mir, the Russian world, promoted under Vladimir Putin and invoked in justification of the Ukraine special military operation. According to Patriarch Kirill, Ruski Mir is the common civilizational space founded on three pillars: Eastern Orthodoxy, Russian culture, and especially the language, and a common historical memory, and connected with its common vision on the further social development. According to him, it's a spiritual concept, a reminder that through the baptism of Rus, God consecrated these people to the task of building a holy Rus. Russia's manifest destiny on this account is to act as the sole remaining bastion of Christian civilization against a godless West and the threat of Islam. We should also take account of the amount of pain visited on the country in its successive divisions and despoliations. Confining ourselves solely to the 20th century, that includes the absorption of the Austro-Hungarian province of Galicia by Poland in the Treaty of Versailles, the carvings up of territory as a result of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact in 1939, and then in 1954, the equally arbitrary gifting of Crimea, 60% Russian-speaking at the time, to Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev. Presumably, which Soviet republic the land belonged to was slightly academic at that stage of the Cold War. And now, after 2 years of the present conflict, Russia currently occupies 18% of Ukraine's soil. If the changes of territory in Ukraine's recent past are dramatic, there is nothing compared to the losses of life in this last century. Perhaps 7 million died in the Soviet Great Hunger of 1932-3, 5 million of them in Ukraine, in a famine caused entirely by Stalin's expropriation of food rather than by crop failure. People literally dropped dead in the streets with no one to bury them. On top of this, another 6.5 million were killed across the Soviet Union in the parallel process of dekulakization, the collectivization of farms and associated killing of successful peasant farmers. And again, many of those deaths were in Ukraine. Then there are the dead of World War II, 5.3 million in Ukraine, 1 in 6 of the population, including 2.25 million Jews, a not inconsiderable number of them at the hands of fellow Ukrainians. And we should also take note of one more layer of pain: the forced deportations of Tatars from Crimea under Stalin, 24% of whom died within 5 years, according to NKVD figures, 46% according to the Tatars themselves. More normal patterns of migration also mean that in the disputed Donbass region, there's a higher Russian and Russophone population. And I think your microphone's on. Whatever President Zelensky may say, and however illegitimate the Russian invasion of 2014, the prospects of reintegrating that part of Ukraine into the country seem weak, not just for military reasons. Of course, Ukrainian pain has to be set alongside perhaps 27 million Soviet casualties in World War II, including maybe 8.7 million casualties from the armed forces. Putin's declared war aim of the denazification of Ukraine builds on the pain of that loss. And we also need to note the historical willingness to sacrifice tens of thousands of lives in order to gain military advantage. It's not just a different actuarial calculation, but a different attitude to the loss of combatants, which separates out Russian and Western military traditions. When it comes to casualties in the current conflict, the first casualty of war is, as we all know, truth. But it would seem that by March 2024, at least 44,000 members of the Ukrainian armed forces had died, with Russian deaths estimated at nearly 3 times that number. Non-fatal casualties will be a significant multiple of both those numbers. A US military intelligence report claims that by the end of 2023, Russian casualties killed or injured totaled 315,000. Then there are the civilian deaths, hard to estimate, but perhaps in the region of 30,000. And in addition, there are a number of refugees, with a third of Ukrainians forced to flee their homes, 5 million displaced within the country, 6.3 million abroad, 17.6 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, according to the UNHCR. From the safety and comfort of the UK, it's hard to imagine the degree of hardship involved in surviving Ukrainian winters with the electricity grid pulverized and so many buildings damaged. All of these losses and the level of them are significant in assessing the morality of the conflict. So too are the economic costs and the amount of military material expended, including copious cluster munitions. Remember, we banned them under the 2008 convention, now signed by 124 states. And according to the Halo Trust, 2 million landmines banned under the 1997 Ottawa Treaty, itself signed or ratified by 164 states. The damage to Ukrainian infrastructure in the first 24 months of the war has been estimated at 119 billion, while the military support given to Ukraine by its allies in the first 2 years amounted to 199 billion pounds, both of those. Drone strikes on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant have risked causing nuclear contamination, even if a Chernobyl-style full meltdown would seem unlikely. But let's take it as read that across the disputed territory, ecological damage through contamination, leakage, and lack of working sewage treatment plants has been caused. After this survey of the background, who could dispute Pope Francis's repeated insistence that everyone loses in war? As the recent Vatican document on human dignity, Dignitas Infinita, puts it, was always a defeat of humanity. No war's worth the tears of a mother who's seen her child mutilated or killed. No war's worth the loss of the life of even one human being, a sacred being created in the image and likeness of the Creator. No war is worth poisoning of our common home. No war is worth the despair of those who are forced to leave their homeland and are deprived from one moment to the next of their home and all the family, friendship, social and cultural ties that have been built up sometimes over generations. It's powerful stuff. All wars, by the mere fact that they contradict human dignity, are conflicts that will not solve problems but increase them. This point is even more critical in our time, when it's become commonplace for so many innocent civilians to perish beyond the confines of a battlefield. End of quote. If we turn now to the just war tradition, Ukraine's justification in waging war would seem pretty easy to establish, although I think that the term just war should be considered an oxymoron in the face of the reality of modern weaponry and the levels of destruction involved in prosecuting a war, despite the propaganda about smart bombs, surgical strikes, and the rest. War never causes justice. War never heals wounds. War never reconciles enemies. It always leaves these tasks for later, makes their accomplishment infinitely more difficult. But nonetheless, let's work our way through the tradition, which you could find in a summary form in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. You might be aware of the distinction in argumentation between jus ad bellum, the conditions which legitimate a resort to armed conflict, and jus in bello, the standards by which must be adhered to by combatants in the conduct of hostilities. While the legitimacy of armed conflict might be established to the satisfaction of those taking up arms, that doesn't let them off the hook when it comes to how they conduct themselves in the conflict. The Catechism underlines the permanent validity of the moral law during armed conflict, quoting Vatican II's Gaudium et Spes on the Church in the modern world. The mere fact that war has regrettably broken out does not mean that everything becomes licit between the warring parties. So the legitimacy of Ukraine's going to war is fairly easy to establish in the terms of just war theory. It's the victim of an unprovoked attack, whether or not one accepts the thesis that the government of Kiev or the whole of the West had been poking the Russian bear in a foolhardy manner since 1989. The call to arms came from a legitimately constituted government. Whatever concerns there might have been about corruption in the judiciary at the time of the invasion, whatever the risks to democracy caused by the suspension of the electoral cycle for the duration of the conflict. A third criterion for jus ad bellum is that it must be a matter of last resort, diplomatic channels and negotiation having failed. Well, diplomatic channels were not even tried so far as we can see, certainly not by the Kremlin, while the international community was asleep at the wheel, failing to respond to the 2014 invasions of both Crimea and the Donbass region. It was not international reaction which stalled the Russian invasion in the spring of 2022, but the ferocity of local defenders combined with the complete military incompetence of Russian commanders. The legitimacy of Ukraine's resort to war is also underlined by the actions of Russian forces in the field. While battlefield atrocities will inevitably have been committed by combatants on both sides, the crimes committed by Russian forces in Bucha and elsewhere, now being recorded with a view to future war crimes trials, in the early stages of the invasion were particularly blatant and grisly and will be remembered by history. These include failure to observe non-combatant immunity, ignoring the Geneva Convention, torturing prisoners, and using rape as a weapon of war. And then there's the meat grinder tactics of Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner group. That would all seem to reinforce the rightness of Kiev's resistance. A more difficult criterion, both regarding the decision to fight and the prosecution of the war since, is the question of the prospect of success and the balance of benefit gained versus damage done. Giving me some figures about the damage done. The scale of the damage to infrastructure and economic life, the cost of the armaments can be put on a balance sheet, even if the sums are unimaginable, and the scale of the Marshall Plan that will be required after the fighting stops, unprecedented. The human cost, both in lost lives and in scarred minds and damaged bodies, does not so easily admit of such reckoning. It has to be quantified in terms of multi-generational trauma and a legacy of hatred which will endure long after the combatants have all gone to their graves. Perhaps psychologically impossible for combatants to ask at the time whether the consequences of resistance could undermine the justification of resistance. But history will arrive at a judgment, or a series of competing judgments on this. The ecological effects will probably only fully become apparent once the front lines have ceased to be no man's land, although there will doubtless be some species that will do well out of the interruption of vast acreages of monocultures and a reduction in the use of petrochemical-based fertilizers. Minefields will remain off limits and continue to wreak carnage for generations, nor is it impossible there might yet be a failure of containment at Chernobyl, at Zaporizhzhia, or one of the other nuclear power plants in the war zone. When it comes to jus in bello, a horrible reality of contemporary war-making calls into question in a far more direct and obvious way the entire enterprise. Western propaganda and the invasion of Iraq often played on the ability of smart bombs and missiles to achieve pinpoint accuracy so that we could watch people killed live on TV as though it were a video game. But most bombs and missiles do not aspire to accuracy, be they cluster bombs designed to clear an area of life or Grad rockets launched in salvos. Behind the front lines is housing, heating, electricity generation, transport infrastructure, and the population's morale which are the target. Another contemporaneous conflict. The IDF's operations in Gaza have shown what non-combatant immunity looks like in modern high-intensity warfare. It looks like 37 million tons of rubble, which it would take 100 trucks a day, 14 years to clear. Rubble which is laced with 10% of the ordnance expended still unexploded. A new term has been coined to describe what's happening: domicide, making a land uninhabitable by destroying the built environment. Nor is there respect by the occupying power for the rights of those they have in their control. But jus in bello also has to reckon with the law of unintended consequences in military operations, especially in an area which has nuclear weapons pointing at it from all sides. Putin theatrically announced the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus in May 2023. Twin risks are that he might deliberately fire such a weapon to call NATO's bluff, and that miscalculation by either side could lead to a full-scale exchange of nuclear weapons, in which case, effectively, we're probably all dead, either immediately or as a result of radiation, the ensuing nuclear winter, and subsequent crop failures. There's no steady state possible in the Ukraine conflict, even if the $61 billion of military aid now being delivered by the USA can prevent a rout of the exhausted Ukrainian forces through the summer ahead. This gaping wound in the heart of Europe leads us inevitably back to Pope Francis's comment in the interview which provoked this reflection. When we look to history, to the wars we've lived through, they all finish with an accord. The fighting in Ukraine is resolving nothing, healing nothing, achieving nothing, beyond the, of course, very important resistance to the aggressor. Moreover, it can't even be viewed as a holding operation. We're in a period of deterioration of international relations, partly due to the great disruptors, Donald Trump and his ilk, the siloed thinking of social media, and the confrontational algorithms of the internet, partly due to the logic of a reignited arms race with the concomitant temptation to exploit any momentary perceived technological or strategic advantage before the other side catches up. In an increasingly chaotic world, with multiple confrontations on different continents, all happening at the same time, mutually assured destruction ceases to be an effective mechanism of détente. I said above that our ethical reflection needs to be contextual, consequential. One of the chief problems with current approaches to warfare, including the framework of just war theory, is that the consequences appear to be not a furthering of the prospects of peace and a limitation of violence, but an increase in the probability of future conflict. We need to be alert to the deliberate sowing of a new rhetoric and political discourse by military leaders and politicians alike. We are moving from a post-war to a pre-war world, according to Grant Shapps, while the head of the British Army has called for us to be prepared for a major conflict on European soil. Some are even willing to put a date stamp on a future war, a possibility maybe 5 to 8 years away, according to the German defense minister. In addition, the ramping up of military expenditure to the great benefit of arms manufacturers and to the cost of everyone else, especially the poor, out of whose mouths bread is being taken by the investment in guns and bullets in every country, rich or poor, is creating a lobby group fueled momentum towards conflict. Whatever the cold light of day strategic calculations provoked by military intelligence, whatever the scenarios being played out by wargaming commanders, what is essential is the rejection of the inevitability of war. There's a duty of political leaders to reinvigorate the United Nations, instead of sniping at international institutions and denigrating the very bodies which could provide the platform for real negotiations and real sanctions against wrongdoers. There's a duty of governments to have back-channel negotiations with regimes which are put in the ever-shifting rhetorical category of the axis of evil. There's a duty to listen to and understand the real motivations and grievances that prompt the actions of potential aggressors, however much we may disagree with their perceptions, in order to answer them and to build relationships which can lead us beyond conflict. There's a duty to educate the public in their understanding of other nations, and perhaps especially of different religions, in order to overcome prejudices that see them solely in terms of enmity and threat. Moreover, just as importantly as these duties that can be laid at the door of those in power, as always in politics, it's the duty of voters to create the political space which allows politicians to think the unthinkable, to walk the extra mile, and to take risks for peace. Church leaders, church members, should be at the heart of this building of a space for seeking peace and justice by means other than war. And now I want to turn to another matter before closing. Pope John Paul II used to like to say that the church is an expert in humanity, although it might be added that we've sometimes been quite good at hiding that fact. Even more so, the church ought to be an expert in Christ. And if you've listened through the whole of my discourse so far, and in particular through my reflections on the application of just war theory to the Ukraine war, you will have noticed I've only mentioned Jesus Christ or the gospel once, and that only en passant. Whether or not my sketch of the history of Ukraine or my understanding of the current conflict has any validity, how on earth could it be that Catholic Christianity could content itself with such a godless, soulless approach to the major questions of our time? Of course, talk of natural law was developed to provide some tools for ethical reflection in a cultural situation which no longer had the shared presuppositions of Christendom. Of course, attempts at objectivity in describing the historical roots of conflict are important. and a good counterbalance to the inflamed rhetoric of the combatants. But the task of the church and of Christians is to offer lived testimony to the gospel. That gospel is, above all, the gospel of peace. If we can follow Matthew in making the Beatitudes the key presentation of Jesus' message, then mourning, gentleness, hunger, thirst for righteousness, mercy, purity of heart, peacemaking, and persecution for righteousness' sake are the necessary expressions of the purity of heart to which he calls us. The calling to be salt and light is made concrete in a series of antitheses which end that same 5th chapter of Matthew. The move beyond anger to the search for reconciliation, the refusal to objectify the others, which is the sinful heart of lust, the outlawing of the economic abandonment of wives, which was the effect of divorce in the ancient Jewish world, being a man or woman of one's word, rejection of the lex talionis and of the logic of retaliation. All of these culminating in loving your enemies, praying for those who persecute you. That's the perfection, or rather the goal, better translation, to which Jesus' disciples are called. That's the vision which we're meant to give flesh to in our community life, and to which we are to invite others. That's the kingdom of God Jesus came to bring. That is eternal life in Johannine terms. That is justification, to use Pauline language, right relationship founded in God's gracious gift, rather than in our own exaggerated estimation of our goodness or our competence. If we turn to the parable of the Good Samaritan in particular, we discover the horrific truth that our presumed enemy, Jesus' hearers, would likely have regarded Good Samaritan as a contradiction in terms, is our neighbor. Moreover, neighbor is something you become by behavior, rather than something which happens by mere juxtaposition. Jesus leaves no wriggle room. The lawyer asks who he is allowed not to love and where the boundaries of obligation are. Jesus sweeps those boundaries away. But he goes beyond that. He pays the price of love, accepting death as the consequence of his way of life, his refusal to condemn, his friendship of sinners, his challenge to hypocrisy, unarmed, vulnerable. That great peace campaigner and teacher John Deere puts it well. They're in the Garden of Gethsemane. Here come the Roman soldiers. What does Peter do? He's thinking, if violence is ever divinely sanctioned in all of human history, if there ever was a just war in all of human history, if ever there was a moment to kill for a good cause, it's here in the Garden of Gethsemane to protect our God. And he's right. We should kill to protect the Holy One. And just as he goes to kill to protect the Holy One, the commandment comes down. Put down your sword. Dear friends, these are the last words of Jesus to the church. It's the last thing he said to the community of men and women around him before he died. It's the last thing they heard. And I think it's the first time they understood who Jesus is. There's power in John Deere's words. And we might point out that peace be with you are the first words that the gathered disciples hear from the risen Jesus, speaking through their fear in the locked upper room. What should we do then? At the very least, we need to shun hatred. The Russians, or the Chinese, the Iranians, or whoever, are not our enemies. They are our brothers and sisters. They're fellow children of God. We cannot stand as disciples before the cross without hearing Christ praying for the men of violence. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We cannot simply accept the divisions of our world, even though we'll doubtless be accused of naivety if we make any efforts to extend a hand of friendship across the barricades that divide our world. At the very least, we need to affirm with renewed force, whatever the question, warfare is not the answer. It's the road to nowhere. It's the deferral of solutions. It's the compounding of problems. At the very least, we need to affirm that the use of weapons of mass destruction which make no distinction between combatant and non-combatant, young and old, human life and natural world, is morally abhorrent, as is the expectation that others be ready to deploy them unthinkingly on our behalf, committing war crimes by simply following orders. Where have we heard that before? as are all nuclear war preparations, and the refusal to live up to our obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to negotiate in good faith for the reduction and eventual removal of nuclear weapons from our world. At the very least, we need this. We need to be unsettled and unsettling, questioning people whom others will view with suspicion as not quite on side, because we have a patriotism larger than my country, right or wrong, and a loyalty to more than our national flag. The king's good servant, certainly, but God's first, to quote St. Thomas More. And perhaps at times that will involve the courage of the white flag, not of surrender, but of parley, walking across the sterile no man's land of partisan politics and bloc thinking, as Francis of Assisi walked through the lines separating Crusader and Arab armies, to say with the modern popes, no more one against the other, no more, never, war never again, war. So, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. I mean, a maestro. You remind me of Storey in many ways. He was also capable of looking at an issue from so many sides at once and bringing it to the most amazingly powerful conclusion, which you've just done. I would like, it's sometimes difficult to go straight into questions and comments, but please, people, if you could probably put things in the chat is the easiest way to do it. Otherwise, I'll try and look out for anybody who's got a hand up or a whatever. But I think I personally would like to start. There's so many things here that are so appropriate just now, and one of the things that always gets me is the powerlessness of the UN, or seems to be what's the powerlessness of the UN. And you alluded to how perhaps the churches and everybody could help that, because it feels that people can pass resolutions that you feel are just, and yet nothing comes of them, which is, I think, a real difficulty at the moment.
I think that, again, I'm no expert on this, but somehow preventing the veto in the Security Council, somehow preventing effectively the big nuclear powers, the top five, from controlling the agenda. I think that's got to be a way forward. Whether they'll ever agree to it, of course, is they quite like a weak UN. It's a bit, why will the US not sign up to the International Criminal Court? Because it doesn't want its own forces being held accountable, and other countries in exactly the same position. So I'm not pointing a finger, but I think that that's the structural weakness. Yeah. But maybe it's something. I mean, dear Bruce Kent, one of his constant. I think the last time he visited me, or I saw him, probably when he visited the university chaplain. I can't remember. Or came to my parish. We came for lunch, and he solemnly handed me a copy of the Declaration of Human Rights, or no, the UN Charter, as a poster and as a booklet, and perhaps we need to reclaim it and champion it once again. I mean, what I was saying about these corrosive, opportunistic taking a pot at the European Court of Human Rights, for instance, because it happens to garner votes within one of your dog whistle politic categories and camps. That sort of thing has to be called out as unacceptable, because it's undermining one of the places of hope in our world. Yeah, anyway. Anything in the chat? Anyone want to ask a question or make a comment?
Yeah, do please. If you want to unmute yourself and just ask a question, rather than putting something in the chat, that's fine too.
Father Rob, may I?
Yeah.
Father Rob, as we approach the election now, we're being bombarded by different parties, different politicians. What would you recommend is the question we should be asking them about you know, their solutions for Ukraine. Because if we said to the average politician, you know, ban the bomb, they're going to laugh at us and they're going to say, well, we'll get bombed ourselves. So what is a sensible question for politicians, or a sensible approach that we can take as Christians?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I've got an easy answer to it. I mean, I just, my stomach is turned by the virility politics of it, you know, whether it's Ernest Bevins saying, well, I want a bloody Union Jack on top of the thing when we first got nuclear weapons, or whether it's Keir Starmer showing I'm as tough as the next guy and jobs are safe in Barrow. Yeah. I think something about that there is going to have to be negotiation. You know, it's not going to be possible to win this by force of arms. I mean, just as Israel is discovering in Gaza. You know, Jeremy Bowen, I think, was saying on the radio yesterday morning that there is now an insurrection. It's not just a battalion of Hamas hidden away somewhere. And insurrections are almost impossible to defeat by military means. I think the whole Ukraine situation is now an intractable problem. And it may be that a holding operation is needed. I think the permitting of Western weapons to hit deep into Russia is highly problematic. The risk of escalation is definitely there. So it might be a question about how do we avoid this becoming an escalation that's taking us to war? You know, as simple as that. I mean, at least every politician should have some sort of answer to that, even if we can't see beyond that, to realize how dangerous these times are, and toughening up is not going to make them less dangerous. Brazening out, you know, probably that might be laughed out of court by some politicians, but I think it's at least it's a reflective approach. Yeah.
Thank you.
What else we got coming up here?
Carol Kellis, can you read that? I studied Russian and spent some time in Moscow and Leningrad, as it then was. My take from that was the realization that the world as seen from Moscow is not the same as the world seen from London or Washington. Do our leaders see
point I was
this?
trying to make, yeah.
Yes. Do our leaders see this but find it convenient to carry on with the line that Moscow sees the world as we do, but just lies about it?
Yeah. I think that's a very appropriate observation. You know, unfortunately, there was a strand. I can't remember the guy's name, but there was one of the leaders of the partisan groups in Ukraine during World War II who did align himself with Hitler, and so the rhetoric of denazification it can find a root in Russian history, in Russian telling of history. So, I mean, from our point of view, it's ridiculous, but it's building on, 70 years of 80 years of telling the story of the Great Patriotic War, and it's very hard to get beyond that, I think. But at least, as I say, we need to go into listening mode to try and understand why do they see it that way. You know, what is the difference, and getting away from our pat answers about it. Yeah.
A thank you comment here. Thank you so much for this. A real dive into the complexity and multi-layered nature of these difficult and intractable conflicts. You've shown me how to think about these conflicts, which is really helpful. I'm really grateful. And then, far from preventing war, the possession of nuclear weapons by Putin has enabled him to wage war.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And of course, again, a complexity there which we should acknowledge is that the deal was Ukraine surrendered its nuclear weapons in exchange for peace guarantees. I think we can probably be grateful that they haven't got nuclear weapons, because they would undoubtedly have used them, I think, in the situation they found themselves. But if you're going to have a disarmament process, there's got to be guarantees with it that can stabilize the situation. And we need to negotiate down. I mean, the fact that a lot of the nuclear limitation treaties are going into abeyance and simply not being renewed, START and all of that stuff is very, very worrying. Yeah, so a new message.
Can I ask a question? It's Pat
oh,
Gaffney.
please
Yeah,
do.
please,
Hi,
Kat.
Pat.
Thanks, thank you. And this is a paraphrase of one of your lines, Rob, but you said somewhere along the lines that the church, one of its roles is to create space for peace before war happens.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about what to me is the weakness of the new document that's just come out from our bishops. Which to me seems to me all about technology and weapon systems and not really proportionality, but more to do with weapon systems and that dimension of war. And nothing about looking at other models of security and other places that you've listed here where the church and the state need to be putting their energy: negotiation, diplomacy, challenging prejudice, challenging stereotype, building a culture. And I just wonder, where you think our church is or is not taking up this challenge from Francis to build a culture of peace and non-violence, and also to have the courage to do so.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think that, again, I'm not knocking the Catholic community, but we're very good at being good citizens. We're not very good at being countercultural, and the majority, again, I love them to bits, but the majority of my parishioners think it's about going to church on Sunday. That's what makes you a good Catholic, It's not surprising. We spent hundreds of years telling them that. But rather than we march to the beat of a different drum, we refuse to buy into the the warmongering. We refuse to bless weapons as though they are some wondrous creation, whether it's a Colt 45 as the peacemaker or all the various other things we've done since. They're diabolical. They divide, they destroy. And we need to unpick that and voice that, I think. But it's not going to make us popular.
Barbara, can I say something?
Yeah, please do.
Valerie, please, yes.
Yes, I too feel that the new document from the bishops doesn't teach peace. Actually, it's called to be peacemakers. There's not a great deal in it about peacemaking, actually, and the components that we need to suggest, because our imaginations need to be fed and stimulated to imagine what are the different routes. But I wanted to pick up on the question earlier about what should we be asking candidates for the elections and so on. My question, I think, if you get into such a discussion, would be, what are you proposing how do you propose to strengthen the soft power of Britain? Because we're not a great power, and we could be getting behind the renewal and reform of the United Nations. We could be restoring our budget for development and aid, and we could also be learning from the research that's been going on for 50 years at the University of Bradford into alternative ways of resolving conflicts. And there seems to be no connection between that research and political decision making. So there's a whole range, I think, of things that we could be repositioning Britain as a different sort of power in the world and not going down the route of this dead end of militarism.
There is a rather nice meme as well doing the rounds on Facebook, etc. Quoting, is it James Cleverly, who talked about too many young people living in their own bubble, and pointing out that the Erasmus program was a very good way of getting young people out of their own bubble and reinstituting that sort of educational link and international exchange. It's kind of, it's such a cheap hit in order to get that dialogue going, you know, and get understanding going. You know, I don't want to buy into tourist, old style Cold War, you know, visits to enlightened Soviet Union any more than anyone else does. But we've got to find some ways of not demonizing people, and yeah. And yeah, it would be interesting to know. I'm ashamed to say I did have the intention of actually sitting down to read through properly rather than flicking through the bishop's document. It would be nice to know, and God bless them for doing it, but it would be nice to know how it was put together and who was consulted and what the process was, you know. I suspect it wasn't terribly synodal.
There's also another comment in the chat about the Russians generally becoming worried as NATO increasingly started moving weapons into areas near to the Ukraine. As Francis said, we poked the Russian bear once too often, and that Putin now feels he has no choice but to create, through force, the buffer zone that he needs to protect Russia from NATO.
We've been, you know, I'm not up to speed on the details. I believe there was a kind of guarantee that NATO would go thus far and no further, but I can't really comment on it because I haven't read up on that. But the idea that, I mean, I think we would all rejoice at the liberation of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all of those nations that have lived under the Russian thumb or boot, whatever. But nonetheless, the idea that we can militarily integrate them is pretty difficult when you've got Kaliningrad in the middle of it, you know. So yeah, I again, diplomacy maybe hasn't been tried, you know, at an earlier stage before Putin became as paranoid as he seems to be. Yeah. Again, Fratelli Tutti, it was kind of in the back of my mind, but as somebody's commented there, why does Fratelli Tutti never get mentioned? I hope that it's kind of entered my bloodstream a bit, but it did occur to me I would do well to go and reread it rather than riffing on it. Could you comment on journalism? I'm aware that I tend to intake current affairs through journalism, yet journalists are forever chasing a story and drop one story for the next story rather than reflecting. In a different context, I often listen to The Rest is Politics with Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. And they do Q&A ones in between their whatever they want to talk about ones. And somebody asked them, how can we actually follow the war in Gaza and what's actually happening on the ground rather than the kind of very sanitized version that we're getting? And their answer, I think it was Alistair Campbell's answer, was he said, I mean, deliberate, talking particularly about that arena, I spend half an hour half an hour a day watching one of the Al Jazeera principal English language news broadcasts. So I'm getting what's being said that side. And I Google various key players every day to see what they've been saying about it. And the other thing is, I think I'm tending to step back a bit from daily papers. I hate the 24-hour news cycle because you never get beyond the headlines, and it's kind of repeated ad nauseum without ever getting beyond the headlines. And I think we need, whatever you want to choose, whether it's the Week or the New European or some of these online news services, that give you something a bit more in depth on a few areas, rather than trying to cover everything and be an expert on anything. You know, I mean, you can tell I'm not an expert on anything here in terms of the historic stuff, but at least you can go a bit deeper and find out a little bit, and not just be spinning on the latest 1.5 minute item on the news. You know.
Mm.
Yeah.
Do you talk about non-violence to your chat? Do you feel the non-violence message is getting out there, being increasing, if you like, or
maybe
not?
Lena, who's on the call, I can't remember if I've talked about non-violence as such. I haven't been violent with any parishioners recently, but
No, not recently. Not last Sunday.
Not recently. Okay. I'm just aware for the work of people like John Deere, who's obviously that's great.
I mean, I finished my homily on Sunday with Martin Luther King's speech the night before he died. You know, so Jesus says, "I will not taste wine again until I drink the new wine in the kingdom." I said, I think he's looking beyond Good Friday. He's saying something about hope. And then I quoted Martin Luther King, you know, "I may not get there with you, but I've been to the mountaintop. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord," you know, which is such a powerful piece. And I think that it's possible to drop these things in, or simply to try and take a sideways look at some of the issues, you know. We have here in particular, we have about around 100, I would think, Ukrainians per week. I lend them the church every Saturday afternoon, have done since October or September 2022. Sometime I only arrived here in September 22. So sometime shortly after that. You know, I'm very grateful that we have their presence. Although, of course, it also brings an awareness of their suffering, you know. Yeah.
I guess for all of us going from here, I'm just wondering where you sit in your own little house somewhere, like, you know, the sun shining at the present moment, you know, what is the most powerful thing that we can do? But I guess you alluded to lots of suggestions within your talk, actually. But a lot of it is examining one's own feelings about this and the levels of hatred that can come up, or anger, very fast, really.
Yeah. Yes, I think, I mean, again, at the beginning, I was trying to process some of that. Well, where did that come from? Why do I think that stuff? Which, you know, we're all socialized into a particular mindset, and it's very hard to step outside what we learned as kids. My country, right or wrong, etc. You know,
And John in the chat has alluded to the climate crisis, and everything is related, actually, because there's so much of and the migration needs, which war obviously increases, and those are good questions to put to your partners.
Yeah, I wrote on Facebook quoting the Pope's message putting up the Pope's message for World Migration Day, which is a very powerful one. It was put on International Independent Catholic News this morning. And I said, you know, we have no drawbridge we can put up to protect us against the effects of globalization, environmental or climate change, our arms sales and the complete disparity in wealth across the, migration is going to happen. It's not, would people kindly stay in their own countries, please? Well, their countries have been destroyed or despoiled. No, they won't. And we, again, maybe to challenge that notion that we can exempt ourselves from the state of the world and carry on living our own, happy little lives.
Which again won't make us popular. But...
No. How do you raise with parishioners who work very hard and want to play hard too, the question of whether regular flights to the Med are a good idea? Because they can afford it.
Absolutely.
Very difficult.
Yeah. John, did you want to say something?
Yes, I think we need to question pilgrimages as well. If we're going to question people flying to the Med, is it right that we should, actually the church should be encouraging people to go on pilgrimage and flying? Why can't we go by train?
I have had that conversation with my diocese. I was very annoyed the last time I went with the diocese on pilgrimage, that whereas I'd been previously with the youth group, therefore I'd gone by coach, which was a pilgrimage. They just booked me without asking onto a plane. So I try not to fly, but not 100% on that one. But there we are. I recommend Lisieux. Lisieux is a good place to go on pilgrimage because that is quite doable by coach. I've taken a parish group there. Yeah.
All right.
Maybe less doable from Hull and Middlesbrough.
Or the north.
The south of England, quite straightforward.
Well, Middlesbrough diocese is actually at Lourdes at the moment, so there you go.
Yeah.
By plane, I guess most of them, I think, anyway. Yeah. Cool. Is anybody else who? Oh, Pat would like.
Sorry, yeah, it's just a thought about something we could all do, and I think going back to the courage that Francis had to use that expression, and the courage that he was calling out from people in using that. I think it's a courage that we all need, but I find personally, and maybe others do, that talking the language of peace and non-violence and challenging militarism or the logic of war and even the sentimentality around war is far more difficult than talking about climate change and talking about poverty. So I just think we need to offer each other a bit more solidarity to build that courage, to build up that courage to speak out. Because we've all said it's not easy, but we need the rigor of the discussion and the debate that you've offered. We need that rigor. We need the scriptural, spiritual base and the courage that gives us. And then we have to get out there and say it. But, knowing that there is a solidarity network of like-minded people is really important, I think, in this work.
Yeah. I think it's almost impossible to do this single-handed. If you don't feel that there's some people who agree with you, yeah.
Which of course Pax Christi has been offering for a long time, which is one of the great. In the same way, when I always find if I go to the NJPN annual meeting in Swanwick each year, I come back with tremendous feelings of that you're not alone, and so there is something very special to be done together, isn't there? To actually finding places to go where you are going to find like-minded people who, yeah, kind of, it does encourage, or maybe you find a different language to say what you've been saying. But I realize also at home, I mean, here in the Diocese of Middlesbrough, we can use the diocesan newspaper for some. This is going to be a source of, I hope, several articles in the diocesan newspaper just to ask, to challenge people.
Great.
Just to have thinking. That's a good word. As long as it's getting out there, isn't it? Well, and trying to make this as public as possible. Or your,
yeah.
Okay, so we're probably nearing the end now. Is there anybody else who wants to say anything before we close? Oh, no, we've got some various things. I think we've probably come to a natural end, which is so it's really just, it's left to me to thank you, Rob. I sometimes find thank you is a kind of, it's a word we use a lot. It's sometimes it's not enough. Tonight it doesn't feel quite like enough, but what you've given us is an amazing amount. There's a thing to challenges a lot of our feelings that we've had. I remember as a small child, Reds under the beds and all that sort of communist thing. And for the first time, actually, I've been challenged to think, to try and understand Putin, which I haven't taken very much time to do before now, but that's a really interesting one. And your ability to give us the history of everything, and not so much of it. As I said, that does remind us of Storey. I'm sure other people will feel that he had that capacity. He was a historian too. So, so yes, thank you again.
A great pleasure. Thank you for the invitation, and blessings on all your work for peace, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
I hope paths will cross again. God bless you.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Okay.